In the completely dark dimness, at a destructive profundity, a jumper took his final gasp and began whipping energetically from each side. He was just barely gotten by rocks, and the main idea at the forefront of his thoughts was endurance. Briefly, he felt the alleviation of having broken liberated from his imprisonment. However, he was met with only vast haziness that was no less choking than the absence of oxygen. Overreacting without any expectation of remaining alive, he swam into the obscure by and by. He had a well-being rope, additional fuel tanks, a buddy, and cutting-edge gear. However, might any of these things at any point ensure endurance submerged? What are the possibilities? Getting away, assuming you're out of oxygen. Shouldn't something be said about assuming that your gear breakdowns? And what do jumpers truly search for? In the destructive profundities, a large portion of us partner plunging with lovely coral nurseries and marine life perception, yet profound water plunges, performed by experts, don't have anything to do with it, particularly with regards to buckle plunging, one of the most mind-boggling and hazardous sorts of submerged swimming. That is the reason the experts in this exchange can be viewed as the best jumpers on the planet. In 1991, the most elite were Parker Turner and Bill Gavin. They drove the most experienced and well-prepared group of cavern jumpers on the planet to investigate one of the most famous submerged cave frameworks, Indian Springs in Florida, USA. On a superficial level, this spot seems to be a little waterway with a rough floor and an opening in the middle, yet the opening is really the entry to submerged caves, which are north of 3 km 200 m long. Turner and Gavin had endured 2 years wanting to review and guide them. Neglected piece of the Indian Springs burrow, what began at a profundity of 90 m. Despite the fact that they had a whole group of jumpers, just both of them should go through the purported limitation. A very tight profound water burrow set at a profundity of 37 m. At last, on November 17, 1991, the submersion began. Yet before that, the jumpers strung a rope through the limitation to have the option to situate in space. Even in the states of unfortunate perceivability, they likewise left decompression tanks a couple of meters from the exit. The thing is, you can't just arrive at the profundities or return up quick with the primary choice. You will get an instance of the supposed profundity inebriation when the cognizance darkens, the developments become sluggish, and you foster a condition of frenzy elation or pipe dreams. That is the reason for profound plunging. They utilize a unique combination of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen called trimic. Yet it turns into an issue in the event that you surface too quick. For this situation, you foster decompression disorder in light of the fact that the nitrogen that has collected in the body as the consequence of breathing in trimic begins gurgling not too far off in the jumper's circulatory system. To forestall this, we really want decompression, a sluggish, frequently multi-hour climb throughout which individuals are suspended in the profundity of water, trusting that the additional nitrogen will leave their bodies during the time spent breathing. So, when Bill Gavin and Parker Turner at last lowered in the Indian Springs cave, they were breathing trimic. In the meantime, the jumpers, who stayed before the limitation, were utilizing compacted air. This equivalent substance was in the decompression tanks. Gavin and Turner effectively passed the tight passage at the entry, and for around 25 minutes, they cheerfully investigated the unseen caverns. They had gotten away from the entry when their gadgets demonstrated they were mostly out of air. The time had come to return, so Gavin and Turner began the rising. However, moving toward the limitation, the men saw billows of mud. They couldn't comprehend where they came from, yet the nearer they got to the leave, the more regrettable their perceivability became. Eventually, they needed to depend solely on the well-being rope for direction. However, sooner or later, it got stopped. The rope driven them to an impasse and was emerging from a heap of rocks and sand. Gavin and Turner traded anxious looks, understanding that the limitation had imploded. The men attempted to clear the section, yet the second they disposed of one stone, another fell in its place, other than their movement worked up much more mud, and the jumpers lacked the ability to see each other any longer. At last, they had to swim back to more clear water and contemplate what to do straight away. However, after taking a gander at their manometer, the two companions acknowledged they just had 10 minutes worth of oxygen left. Bill Gavin chose to search for one more exit, in spite of realizing it didn't exist, and when he got back to where he left Parker Turner, the man wasn't there. Bill thought his companion had gotten out, and confident, he swam to the limitation, yet arriving at it made him shudder with ghastliness. Gavin comprehended that his buddy was left without any possibility returning or air to continue to stand by, yet it appeared as though he took his final gasp, left his gear, and swam forward in the expectation of arriving at the additional air tanks. Whatever had occurred there seemed a little section in the blockage, and Gavin figured out how to just barely get himself through at this point. He had oxygen for close to 30 seconds, so Bill swam however quick as he could. The perceivability might have been near zero because of the mud mists, yet he wanted to see Parker any second. Unexpectedly, Bill's air had run out, and pausing his breathing, he figured out how to utilize all of his leftover ability to arrive at the life-saving oxygen. Yet Turner wasn't there at that point. Gavin understood his companion had passed on. The salvage crew had the option to affirm this main the next day, when the mud mists in the cavern settled and Turner's body was found only 30 m from the additional oxygen tanks. He was the world's best cavern jumper and battled until the end. However, nature won this fight. Indian Springs stays one of the most well-known and troublesome plunging spots, yet it's a long way from being the only one. It tends to be tested by 4 sharks. Blue opening in the Bahamas. It's a 10 m wide restricted coral bowl which slowly enlarges and gives approach to the kick sinkhole. It goes down to a profundity of 60 m, yet in far off upper corner, there's a limited break has drawn in jumpers' consideration. In 1997, one of them was burglarized. Parker, a gifted English pellist mountain climber and one of the world's best jumpers that year, he was welcome to shoot a narrative about the Bahamas blue openings ransack ready for the submersion by plunging with his friend Dan Malone. For 10 days in a row, they plummeted to a profundity of north of 106 m. 4 sharks, yet didn't enter the actual cavern, so when the jumpers were given 2 days to rest before the beginning of the recording, burglarized chose to covertly plunge into the kick sinkhole and investigate the hazardous opening in its far-off corner. There were reports that it concealed a tremendous chamber with already inconspicuous views. Parker was an explorer, so Malone didn't attempt to work his friend out of it, choosing to go with him. Rather, different jumpers who found out about their arrangement chose to join the 2 men to help them loot, and Dan paused for the second when there were serious areas of strength for no in the cavern and began their drop. As it turned out, the break they'd been wanting to swim through got as restricted as 60 km, so the men needed to remove their oxygen tanks and drag them behind. Eventually, the section turned out to be thin to the point that the jumpers couldn't move. Dan Malone was mad, attempting to sort out what to do, when unexpectedly he saw that by some marvel Sway had just barely gotten himself through and vanished. At last, the 2 of them wound up in a monster, unseen cavern with stunning perspectives. However, practically immediately they needed to return, since as a result of the entry being so thin, they'd just taken little oxygen tanks. With them shocked and miserable, the jumpers started their process back, yet at a profundity of 76 m. Dan ran out of trimix. He was very nearly 10 m more profound than recently arranged, yet had no choices other than to change to compacted air. At this profundity, it was risky, and Dan quickly began encountering serious tipsiness. It was nitrogen narcosis. It resembled he brought down 12 jugs of brew in one go. In any case, Malone was an accomplished jumper and figured out how to keep mentally collected. Dan was gradually pushing ahead, and bit by bit got back to the limited break there. As expected, he thought back to ensure ransack was likewise doing all okay. It took the jumper a couple of moments to understand that right at that point, his companion began to go down to the base. Dan rushed descending lastly. Gotten Lute's leg. The man appeared to be breathing. Air pockets were emerging from his mouthpiece yet. That didn't console Dan Malone. First and foremost, he had lost both of his flippers, which dialed him back fundamentally. Furthermore, he needed to push the oblivious Lute through a thin passage. Thirdly, the jumper felt the ongoing in the cavern become a whole lot more grounded. Yet before Dan began genuinely stressing, out of nowhere burglar eyes came around and swam forward happily. Dan couldn't completely accept that his own eyes yet felt unimaginable help. At long last, the two jumpers entered the tight break, prompting the exit and the additional oxygen tanks. Yet it turned out getting them would be quite difficult by any stretch of the imagination. Eventually, the current got areas of strength, for so men needed to clutch the security rope so as not to float back. They were in a real sense utilizing their arms to pull themselves forward, as though moving up a rope. At long last, having applied tremendous endeavors, Dan figured out how to break. Liberated from the destructive snare, he got one of the additional decompression tanks before he ran out of air. Totally, and very much like in the past story, where Bill Gavin was expecting to see his mate Parker, Dan Malone coordinated his electric lamp at the break in the air. Stone hanging tight for Lute, yet burglar eyes wasn't coming. Dan was using up all available time. He was still affected by nitrogen narcosis and had too little oxygen, so the man motioned toward the help jumper Tom to help ransack. Finally, Tom turned out too massive to even consider going through the break. Additionally, he was running out of air too. Dan Malone was shocked to acknowledge he just had two choices: to hurry to burglarize his salvage and unavoidably kick the bucket, or endure 3 hours going through decompression to bring back the news that Lute wouldn't be returning. Dan picked the subsequent choice, and Lute's body was recuperated and re-emerged a couple of days some other time when the flows debilitated. However, every jumper arriving at critical profundities knows there's a gamble of staying submerged. Everlastingly getting a dead jumper's body to the surface may once in a while be very difficult or even unthinkable, particularly if the jumper kicked the bucket at outrageous profundities. Like in Bushman's opening, it's a Goliath well-like cavern with a profundity of 283 m. Yet it's found not in the sea, but rather at a confidential homestead in South Africa at north of 1.5 over the ocean level. That is the reason. In fact, lowering to its floor is identical to plummeting to the profundity of 339 m, to be more exact. That is the profundity for which the decompression plan is determined, since this cycle additionally has to do with pressure, and at the elevation of 1/1/2 chem, it's not equivalent to at the ocean level. The cycle is convoluted to such an extent that the imprint was gone after the absolute first time by the unbelievable jumper Nuno Gomes in 1996, establishing the worldwide best for the most profound cavern submersion. The drop took him about 14 minutes, and the decompression went on for north of 12 hours. At this point you comprehend exactly how risky and complex the errand of vanquishing the Bushman's entire is, and why the cavern is such a bait for jumpers from everywhere the world. One of them was a youthful South African outrageous lover, Dion Dreyer, who was 20 years of age. Back in 1994, the young fellow had around 200 submersions added to his repertoire when a gathering of jumpers offered him to participate in their investigation of Bushman's opening. Dion was excited as he dove into the apparently little puddle, went through the limited vertical passage, and regarded himself as in one of the world's greatest freshwater buckles. The gathering of jumpers effectively arrived at the arranged level of 150 md. Despite the fact that they couldn't see anything with the exception of totally dark obscurity, they got what they came for. They'd vanquished Bushman's opening. Still, the gathering was in for a sluggish rising with extended decompression, so the jumpers began advancing back, watching out for one another's condition. the man swimming before Dion checked whether he was okay. Occasionally, the young fellow signaled that everything was extraordinary, and they kept moving. However, at one moment that the more established jumper turned around to mind Dion, he didn't see him any longer. Just a faint beam of light was coming from the profundities. Sickened, the jumper acknowledged it was Dion's spotlight suffocating. Running with him, the man halted the other gathering individuals and swam, descending as quickly as he could. Yet Dion was falling excessively quick and wound up at a dangerous profundity. Nobody from the gathering could do anything. With a feeling of horrible sadness and the acknowledgement of Dion's demise, the jumpers needed to proceed their numerous-hour decompression process. After arriving at the surface, they called the salvage group. The heroes sent a robot to the lower part of Bushman's opening, however didn't figure out how to find Dion's body. The young fellow's folks were crushed. Had they lost their child as well as denied an opportunity to give him a legitimate farewell? The Bushman's opening turned into his grave, so they introduced a dedication board there. Years passed, and the memory of the misfortune started gradually blurring until 10 years after the fact, Dave Shaw plunged into the cavern. This accomplished 50-year-old jumper turned into the third individual to have arrived at the characteristic of 244 m. In Bushman's opening, Shaw got to the cavern's extremely base. He was pointing his electric lamp at everything around him when, unexpectedly, he saw a human body. Dave promptly acknowledged it was Dion Dreyer. The man attempted to get the body up to the surface. However, the departed jumper's oxygen tanks were stuck, so Shah denoted the spot to find the body there. Following time, he'd returned and went up to the surface. He informed the police about his find and reported to his partners and Dion's folks that regardless of all that, he planned to recuperate the young fellow's body from the cavern's floor. It was a mind-boggling activity, so the groundwork for it was exceptionally cautious. Just about 10 jumpers should remain at various profundities and hand each other Dion's body, which Dave needed to wrap into a unique pack. The activity began toward the beginning of the day of January 8, 2015. Everybody expected their positions, and the jumper nearest to Shah was watching his spotlight move close to the base, pausing for the man to begin climbing. Yet things didn't go very as flawlessly for Shaw. After arriving where he recently found Dion, the man saw that his gear was still there, and the actual body had floated away. Shaw began searching for itself, lastly saw it in the profundity of water close by. Still, this confounded Shaw's errand, so he took more time than he determined. In the meantime, the jumper above him saw Dave's electric lamp begin to move rapidly. Lastly, stopped. The man paused and checked out at the spot of light at the base. Eagerly, yet it stayed in one spot in the long run. The jumper chose to go further to check how Shaw was doing. What he saw stunned him. Dave was lying dead on the floor of the cavern. No jumper in the group was sufficiently qualified to go to the lower part of Bushman's opening, so it was difficult to assist Shaw, with Knight assuming he was as yet alive. Moronic, struck by what he just saw, the jumper composed something on an extraordinary board and gave it to his accomplice above. In this manner, their composing arrived at the surface, and everybody figured out that Dave wasn't returning. Considering the trouble of lowering to the lower part of Bushman's cavern, everybody needed to embrace the frightful situation that Dave and Dion could stay there. Always Shaw's group and Dreyer's folks were crushed at this point. There was nothing they could do, so they began pressing to leave this destructive spot as quick as could be expected. However, before they drove off, something mind-boggling and unforeseen happened. Bubbles showed up on the water surface, followed by the collections of Dave and Dion. It's muddled precisely why and how it worked out, yet Shay figured out how to get the departed jumper to the surface, regardless of whether at the cost of his own life. We realize that no less than 4 jumpers have lost their lives in Bushman's opening, yet it stays a world-renowned hub for the accomplished devotees of the super. By certain spots are much more risky than this cavern, and they have gained notoriety For an explanation, the American city of scenic Rosa in the province of New Mexico flaunts its own blue opening. It's famous with both experienced jumpers and novices. This supply is a characteristic artesian well, with perfectly clear water from above. It seems to be a little lake with a breadth of 24 m, nearly multiplying in width close to the base. The cavern's profundity is additionally 24 m, yet these boundaries don't seem like anything, contrasted with the destructive spots we examined beforehand. So for what reason are we discussing scenic Rosa blue opening that is on the grounds that at the lower part of this normal pool there is an entry to a cavern framework? The obscure passages were first investigated by two fledgling jumpers in 1976, yet scenic Rosa caves ended up being excessively unforgiving with amiers. The men lost all sense of direction in the submerged stone labyrinth and kicked the bucket. The hunt and recuperation of their bodies was a difficult errand for the nearby salvage group entering. The caverns required flawless plunging abilities, and the heroes had no guide for direction in the passages. Still, they figured out how to find and surface the dead jumpers' bodies. Besides, during the time spent there pursuit, the salvage group investigated a piece of the caverns and arrived at a profundity of 58 m. Anyway, the submerged passages turned out to be hazardous to such an extent that the land proprietors chose to obstruct the entry to them with a metal lattice. It remained there for a considerable length of time, until 2016, when a gathering of expert Voyager jumpers was approved to plan the taboo caverns. Every one of them were really capable jumpers, so the undertaking had the most ideal. Arranging the principal individual to enter the cavern should be Mike Youthful, and meanwhile his partner Shane Thompson should remain on the ground in the save, so to speak. Thompson used to act as a plunging educator for the U.S. Naval Force and had close to 20 years of involvement. Perhaps that is the reason he would have rather not paused and jumped into the blue opening along with Youthful, and it was Shane who was quick to push through the tight entry to the cavern framework separated from it. Being black as night, the jumpers had likewise additionally upset the residue that had been gathering at the base for a considerable length of time, so this promptly caused a huge drop in perceptibility, and the spotlights were nearly of no assist in the sloppy water, with stilling the jumpers continued to move. Furthermore, soon Shane saw a passage that appeared to be prompting an enormous cavern. However, the sloppy water and the optical deception prevented the men from understanding the situation in its entirety. The truth was that the passage got much smaller prior to transforming into a wide cave, so moving while at the same time depending only on touch. Shane came to the tightest spot and got adhered. Besides, because of unfortunate perceivability, Youthful didn't see at first that something had turned out badly and needed to pass by his buddy, yet stalled out too. By the by, he resisted the urge to panic and understood that the main ideal choice was to get back to the pass spot. Yet Shane, for reasons unknown, lost his restraint and began whipping as though in a seizure, hitting his kindred jumper with his flippers and attempting to push forward. At first, Youthful, who effectively arrived at the wide passage, failed to see what had happened. He trusted that Shane will return. However, the man was taking extremely lengthy. Youthful moved toward the thin section once more and was bewildered to see that Shane was gone. Youthful figured out how to help his head and arm with the electric lamp through the break. In any case, Shane was mysteriously gone. The man needed to choose whether to risk stalling out and perhaps kicking the bucket to track down Shane, or to abandon his colleague for Youthful. It was an undeniable decision, so he gradually began pushing ahead. It required an extremely lengthy investment. Yet the jumper arrived at the following cavern. He swam to the vastest passage, trusting that Shane had done likewise. Lastly, toward the finish of a very steep and limited section, Youthful saw his kindred jumper dead. It shook the man profoundly, and he understood that now he needed to battle for his own life to successfully return to the surface and educate the others regarding his colleagues. Passing Youthful spent the entirety of his energy and oxygen supply yet at last figured out how to return out anyway. Getting Shane's body once again to the surface consumed a large chunk of the day. And a major group, nobody saw precisely exact thing had occurred, and why yet the demise of an expert like Shane was confirmation that cavern plunging can be destructive, no matter what the jumper's ability, level and experience. The Nick Rosa burrows were shut perpetually, and a commemoration board was introduced close by. Albeit these misfortunes cast a shade upon the historical backdrop of jumping roughly 6 million individuals on the planet. Keep doing it actually experienced. Jumpers caution that the sea and caverns should be treated with liability and regard, or they can get horrible payback. What is your perspective? Is it worth the effort to attempt to get a dead jumper's body to the surface, regardless of how serious the gamble?